Well, I was born in Edmonton in May of 1943, as my father was a cabinet minister at the time. Didn't live up there for very long. We moved to a small community in southern Alberta and then on to Ottawa, where Dad was a member of Parliament, and lived there until I was 15 years old, but came back to southern Alberta regularly to the farms and ranches of my relatives who lived there. So I consider myself bicultural. Living in a national capital is very different from living on a farm next to the foothills in southern Alberta. So that made me appreciate the country, I think, better than people who just live in the east and never experience the advantages of living in a place where you can go out and catch fish in the river and then actually eat them. Whereas in Ottawa, you always felt that you were taking your life in your hands if you ate anything you caught out of the the Ottawa River. So
you were also part of the Mormon faith as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
My family was Mormon, and it was a large family, so 8 kids. And I was the only one of the 8 that was in a position, not so much because of my situation, but because of my parents' situation, to serve a mission. So part of the Mormon religion is that young men are expected to devote 2 or 2.5 years of their lives to go out and spread the gospel. And I had never really been a true believer. I was really interested in human belief systems and how human beings develop their interpretations of life. So I wasn't ever really captured by the church in that way. So it wasn't really a matter of me leaving the church. It was more of a matter of me resisting the efforts of the church and my family to bind me to the church. I agreed to serve the 2 years on the mission based on assurance that I had from my family and the church authorities that if I was earnest in seeking the truth, that it would come to me. And all I had to do was to honestly make the effort. And because I was, young and impressionable, I guess, I believed them. But when they sent out the instructions for us to memorize as missionaries, you're expected to learn the lesson plans that you would then base your teaching on. And I was living here in Calgary at that point. I went out to Riley Park to learn the lessons, and as I was going through them, I X'd out all of the conclusions in the lesson plan because none of them logically flowed. They were all leading questions, and I realized at that point that this was something that would be equivalent to selling vacuum cleaners or something else. It was really not designed to help people understand what truth is and how to find it. I was so depressed by that, I stumbled downtown and walked into the first movie theater I came to without looking at the marquee to see what was playing. And it turned out that the movie was Judgment at Nuremberg, which was the war trials at the end of World War II. And the essence of those war trials were that people, the judges in Germany, believed that they were doing the right thing and that they were not aware of the road that their sacrificing of some of the principles of law and justice had on the future, and that they claimed that and I believe it's true, that they simply didn't know where their conformity to the existing belief of the regime, the Nazis, they didn't know where it would lead. They didn't, they couldn't foresee the Holocaust in their view. But that lesson got burnt into my mind, and I had been reading books on psychology, psychiatry. My dad was appointed to be a juvenile and family court judge on the Lethbridge Medicine Hat Circuit, and I would accompany him because he had a heart condition from time to time when I could. And while I was waiting for him to do his work as a judge, I would browse the library at Medicine Hat College, or the courthouse in Medicine Hat, and I started reading books on the psychology of crime because Dad would share with me situations where, as a judge, he had to make a decision on the fate of, in one case in particular that I remember, a young girl, a 13-year-old girl who had waited for her father to come home and had borrowed the neighbor's hunting rifle and blew her father's head off. That she just couldn't handle being raped for another night. And he had to decide what to do, to charge her with murder or what. And watching him and listening to him wrestle with that decision really pushed me to be thinking about why people do the things that they do. And I had been exposed to the Holocaust very early on, images.
Paint us a picture. How old were you? What were the circumstances, and who were you with?
I would have been probably no more than 7 or 8 years old. And because we were living in Ottawa, and Dad had been a member of the the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and he was given reports of the liberation of the extermination camps in Germany at the end of the war. And some of those reports had pictures in them, just still photographs of the bulldozers pushing up stacks of human bodies into trenches. And as a kid, I was deeply troubled by that and felt a sense of shame about our species. I couldn't understand how human beings could do that. And when I would ask questions of the adults, the answers were never good. They were superficial, and it was sort of blame the Germans or the Nazis. And I just developed a very early drive to try to understand why human beings do the things that they do, particularly things that cause waste, suffering, or injustice.
So looking back on that moment, do you feel it was a missed opportunity for the adults to explain to a kid the horrors of what was going on, especially in the concentration camps?
I don't know if it was a missed opportunity. I think that they genuinely didn't know how to explain it. I think that, when you talk to survivors of the Holocaust, many of them will say you can't explain it. It's just a mystery how human beings could do this. I believe it can be explained, and I've spent most of my adult life mapping out the dynamics of how human beings develop their conduct standards and what it takes to develop a sense of justice and compassion and to try to figure out how to avoid creating waste and suffering.
So since then, you've read thousands of books, you've done a lot of lifelong research, and you've also mapped out human intelligence systems. So can you describe some of your work, starting from those moments early in life all the way till now into the Human Venture Institute?
I don't think I've read thousands of books. I own thousands of books, but I buy far more books than I can read. And my justification for doing that is that by exploring and investigating what books are in print and tracking the publication of books, I get a sense of what I call the information scape. It's just sort of the sum total of human striving, learning, failure that's been encoded and then shared as a cultural resource. And that by buying a book that I know could be useful at some point, I'm really putting a survey marker on my own ignorance. People often think of ignorance as being just something that you never know anything about. It's just a complete blank space. But you can know something about things that you don't know. And knowing that it's possible to discover things that could be helpful is a really fundamentally important part of human learning dynamics. So the feeling you get when you walk into a big bookstore or a big library of being overwhelmed is appropriate. There's, it's this ocean of knowledge that you're immersed in, but that at the same time that you're feeling overwhelmed, you should feel or you should feel encouraged, because this tells you that this is something you could learn, and you have to have a particular kind of obsessive compulsive disorder in order to believe that it is worthwhile to continue acquiring books that you know you're never going to have time to read. But I know that they exist once I've bought them, and that sort of learning that way is fundamentally important in a society where you can't count on your schools or your the training you get at work or the existing media to tell you everything that's important to know. You have to take responsibility for your life learning. Of my approach when I went on the mission, and I did serve the full 2 years, but I refused to teach because I didn't have a conviction that the church was true. I started tracking my own learning and drawing on as much as I could to inform my learning. And I kept a journal, so this goes back to many, many years. So when I was 19, this was one of my fundamental principles. If there's anything I do not appreciate, it is because I do not understand it. If there's anything that I do not understand, it is because I was not prepared to understand. The implication of that last bit is that it's my responsibility to prepare myself to understand. But I found that I couldn't trust my own judgment. And that, as an example, in buying books, I've bought books for my whole life, but I'd go into a good bookstore and I'd be scanning the bookshelves to see what was interesting, that I would pass over many books, and I stopped to think about, why am I passing over these books? Maybe there's something worthwhile in them. So I would push myself to buy books that I was not the least bit interested in. And when I would dig into them, I discovered this is actually interesting. So that, we're full of prejudices that we don't acknowledge ourselves, and that those prejudices confine our learning and the scope of our learning substantially. So if you need to do something that counters that prejudice to make sure that you're not trapped by your own suppositions and assumptions.
So you're working more now in the Human Venture Institute. This is something that you developed and created through your mapping systems. Can you describe a little bit of your research over the years and what has developed now?
Sure. The Human Venture Institute is based on this new discipline that I've spent my life developing. Other people are involved now, and it will become something that's established at some point into the future. And the discipline is human learning ecology. And in human learning ecology, we're just mapping out the dynamics of adaptive power and intelligence in human systems. Human systems include individuals, primary groups, relationships between individuals who know each other quite well and support each other, families, friends, close colleagues, organizations, communities, societies, and civilizations and species, so that you can't understand learning if you only focus on individuals. You have to take into account what a culture or civilization has learned, because individuals can't learn things for which there is no existing clue or guidance or some part of knowledge to support their effort to learn. Nobody on this planet knew what caused disease prior to the 1850s, and we thought we knew, but we were wrong. So we thought it was bad smell, or we thought it was imbalanced humors, but it was only with the development of capacity to study microorganisms, so with the grinding of lenses, so we can build microscopes that allow us to see life forms that are much smaller than we can take in with unaided eyesight. But we began to understand that it's the germs that cause disease. It's not the bad smells. Malaria is not caused by bad air, the way the name of the disease makes it sound. It's caused by a parasite that's carried by a mosquito. And until we'd inquired enough about the causes of the disease and developed a more accurate picture, our efforts to treat malaria through, as we did, through creating cold, sweet-smelling air, because the belief was that if it's caused by bad air of swamps, then the way you treat it is by having people breathe cool, good air. So you had to have perfume and some way of cooling the air down. But human history is full of that kind of example of things where we simply didn't know enough to do the diagnostics and design. So human learning ecology studies the dynamics of learning as it occurs from individuals all the way out to civilization, where we're trying to understand how to support learning that will enable people to reduce the waste, suffering, and injustice that we create through our activities. So we draw on the combined record of striving, achievement, and failure across periods of history, across fields of endeavor, and across different cultures. So we look at the broadest possible range of human activity. We're only scratching the surface. I don't want to give the impression that we've figured out how to do all of this, but we've got a good start on it. And a simple way of explaining what we're doing at the Human Venture Institute is that we're trying to figure out how to keep human beings from repeating the same stupid mistakes over and over again.
Looking back on some of the lessons that you've learned, how can you explain the way that people use it's the right thing to do and the truth, which is something that you encountered early in life?
It required a fair bit of investigation into what we term verification logic, verification standards for both conduct and for knowledge. So that there are two broad categories. There are many human powers, or adaptive power and intelligence is a multi-leveled and multi-dimensional capacity. It's not a simple capability at all. But that we judge what the right thing to do is based on the same principles we use for judging anything. Now, judgment is not well understood in our society, and that in order to understand judgment, you have to understand the characteristics of that which is being judged. You also have to understand the capacities and the priorities of the judge and the circumstance in which the judgment is being made. And that truth, as many people think of truth as simply being reality, truth is more complicated in that truth is a claim about accuracy of correspondence, about the representation of something in reality. And that people make the claim of something being accurate based on different priorities and different standards. So that the most common truth standard that people use is based on conformity or affirmation to the tribal values. So it's our sense of identity shapes our sense of what is true or what we're prepared to consider as being accurate. As human beings are fundamentally small troop animals, and that if you look at the history of our species, and you won't understand current events and what we see around us every day without understanding where we came from. Human beings spent 50,000 generations in a small troop hunter-gatherer period. We spent 500 generations in the agricultural period. So just to repeat that, 50,000 generations small troop hunter-gatherer, just 500 in the agricultural period. We spent about 22 generations in the industrial period, and now 1.25 generations in the digital convergence period. We are designed primarily for small troop hunter-gatherer. As troop primates, we have certain tendencies and drivers that create most of the really difficult things we see on the news every night, and also the difficult things that we encounter in human relations. So the current issues around sexual predation and the exploitation of women by powerful males is a carryover from our small troop primate phase, where being an alpha male, which you had to fight for, gave you feeding and sexual access privileges that is characteristic of small troop primates generally. And that in the development of civilization, we have to reconstruct or mitigate those biosocial drivers that we inherit from earlier stages of development. And those early stages of development were based on a might is right principle, where dominance and aggression is rewarded with both food and reproductive privileges. And that is perfectly, that works as long as we're operating in an environment where the horizons of engagement for people socially is confined to the tribe and the troop, and out-group enmity or hostility with in-group amity or devotion works at that stage of development. It stops working well at the point where human beings are developing cities and civilizations, and it becomes positively homicidally destructive at the point where we're capable of industrial war. So it's, the human beings are not a finished product. We are a work in progress. And in order for humanity to progress well, we have to understand what progress is and what it isn't, and how easy it is for us to fool ourselves about that. And that's what the Human Venture Institute is dedicated to, mapping out and understanding what real progress is in terms of our species.
On that note, what can people take away from your mapping system?
That humanity is a work in progress, and that we can discover what progress is and what it isn't, and that we all have responsibility. We think of responsibility mostly in terms of our immediate affiliations to our work or our family, but we also have responsibility to those two fundamental communities to which we belong, life and humanity, and that we will learn how to become better human beings only to the extent that we study the human story well and try to identify the causes for our failures of humanity, and why waste, suffering, and injustice is something that continues to be created, and then look at human achievements and understand something by a process of basically reverse engineering of exploring how human beings learned how to accomplish the things that they accomplished, and then put together a progressively comprehensive picture of the dynamics of learning and the battles that we have to fight in order to be able to learn well and to keep from being captured by our basic biosocial natures and all of the things that we're subject to as basically lazy primates that cause us to kind of pull back from wanting to have to make all of that effort.
Absolutely. So you shed some light on some of these topics already, but can we get some words of wisdom or perhaps some words of hope in the discouragement of violence, hatred, waste, and suffering within our world?
When you think about what human beings celebrate and what we get an emotional reaction to, if you sort of make a list of things that we can identify through mapping of failures of discipline, of caring, of responsibility, of willful ignorance, and just give people a list of these indicators of an absence of these existential disciplines, an absence of compassion, an absence of justice or caring, and ask them how they feel when they encounter examples of it. Everyone, virtually everyone, says it frustrates them, makes them feel angry, that we're wired to respond emotionally. Emotions are a form of intelligence. Now, they will never tell you what's going on. They'll tell you something significant is going on, but they won't tell you what it is, and they won't tell you what to do about it. So it's a kind of a gauge that tells you should be paying attention. But in the same way that we get a strong emotional reaction to things that cause waste, suffering, and injustice, we also get very strong positive emotional reactions to when we see instances of kindness. When we think about the Christmas season as something that comes around, like everything once a year, and the kinds of emotions that people feel, and the reasons why productions or movies or plays like A Christmas Carol or A Wonderful Life, what causes us to have these really strong emotional reactions there? What you see is is an illustration of the development of wisdom through learning. So in the case of Christmas Carol, you get the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of present Christmas, and the ghost of the future. And that understanding that all life unfolds in a past, present, future dynamic, and it's our capacity to anticipate the future is based on our understanding of the past and where we came from and the consequences of acting the way we did. The movie Groundhog Day, which seems just like a romantic comedy, is actually a profound illustration of the evolution of wisdom. So the main character, Bill Murray, is just continuing to do stupid things, and none of the things that he's driving for come to pass. But he slowly learns to pay attention after repeating the same day over and over and over again, that what he does or doesn't do has an impact on other people. So he comes to realize that he's not just living for himself, he's living for others. And at that point, it becomes possible to actually start developing wisdom as an active thing. It's not a passive sitting on a mountaintop contemplating your navel. It's about how you are engaging with the world around you and other people, and that we are actually wired for the pursuit of wisdom, and that we call Santa Claus, not because Santa is some sort of meaningless word that means he brings gifts. It means saint. And when you start to think about what does it take to learn to become a saint, it's just basically reaching for, seriously, the better angels of our nature, and that we're complicated creatures because of the levels of programming that make us up. But there are definitely better angels of human nature and worst angels of our nature, and that we will never reach those better angels if we don't understand them, if we're not paying attention, and if we're not actively committed to actually doing it. We're not finished products, and that how we are shaping ourselves, it depends on the decisions we make when we get out of bed in the morning, and the kinds of things that we spend our time with, and the engagements that we take on, and the slow but purposeful development of our meaning-making capacities, and that we all could or should be striving to become elders, or to become good ancestors, so that generations in the future can look back on us and be encouraged at least a little bit to reach for the better angels of their nature as a result of whatever we've been able to create and pass on to the next generations.
I do want to talk about this book here, actually. So tell us a little bit about history.
Sure. This book is the Silatunirmut report, Pathway to Wisdom. Silatunirmut is an Inuktitut word that simply means the pathway to wisdom. And I did a lecture at the University of Montreal way back in 1988, 87, and must have been 88. And it was videotaped, and they replayed it on cable television there. And an Inuit woman saw the tape and tracked me down and came out and spent a couple of days with me because she was very drawn to the way I was talking about empowerment and human learning, and that the Inuit, along with the Cree in Arctic Quebec, had been given responsibility and control of their school system, their manpower training systems, their community government system, and their healthcare system as a result of the signing of James Bay 1, 1975. So they're given a lump sum payment and a devolution of power and responsibility, so they became more autonomous. But it turned out that the education, the schooling system in Arctic Quebec was not doing what needed to be done, so that the kids were not learning well enough to go on to post-secondary education, and that they were also not thriving in their own communities. So the suicide rates, the alcoholism, drug addiction rates were very high, and that they set up an educational commission to investigate what could be done with their schooling system. And to make a long story short, they contracted with me to be their chief writer and researcher, which then developed this report just focusing on how to assess and redesign their schooling system so that it would support lifelong learning and development with the kids living in the Arctic. I worked with the school system from 1970 to 1983, heading up a research team, just trying to figure out how to equip youth with the capacity to be resourceful, resilient, responsible human beings beyond the boundaries of convention, so that you can always train people up to observe institutional standards and rules and routines if you put in enough pressure. But at a time in history when the pace of change is so high that you can't rely on just passing on and enforcing the standards from one generation to the next. You have to be prepared to develop new standards and new understanding based on changing conditions. And that I was hired by the school system to try to figure out how to equip young people to be able to learn from life, and also to figure out whether schools were helpful in that process or harmful. It's a sort of a balance. It's almost a near-run thing in that the school system does as much harm as good with the instruction, and that can be understood probably most readily by a simple comparison or parable of the garbage bear. You know what happens to bears in the national parks if we're not careful about the disposal of garbage? They become dependent on the garbage for their food supply. And in the process of doing that, they don't learn how to hunt. So they become a problem. And the reality is our education system creates intellectual garbage bears, or people who are dependent on being taught. Now this is not new, and it certainly isn't anything that I discovered or originated on my own. That education reformers have recognized that for hundreds of years. That teaching people how to think well for themselves is not something that is easily accomplished, and there's always resistance to it because you threaten the establishment, you threaten the existing order dramatically when you teach people how to think for themselves and how to question authority and hold it accountable. And that's the main reason why this work is so hard, is that we can innovate and teach people how to think in areas of technology where the results are not going to be particularly threatening, other than the fact that a new microchip or a new computer might put another company out of business. But it's not going to threaten the power structures. But if you teach people how to think critically about our conduct and our value system and why we value the things that we do, and how do we assess the governing philosophy of our societies, that you make them threatening to the power structures. And as a result, progressive attempts to equip human beings to learn well from life have always been resisted by the established authorities. And as a result, as part of education and development for people to support the kind of learning that's necessary to make sure that we'll survive the 21st century, is that they have to learn how to engage in what we describe as the thoughtscape battleground, where that they are prepared to be attacked and to be undercut or opposed because of their drive to learn and to better understand what would make for a more just and a healthier society.
Accumulating all of your research and all of your life work and your development of Human Venture Institute, what would you like to see for the future?
Well, I'd like to see the Human Venture approach continue to expand, and it's important to recognize that the maps and the precepts, the principles, the standards that we're uncovering and mapping are not something that can or should be copyrighted. It would be like trying to copyright the sun. They're just part of human heritage. If you're a human being, this is part of your story. And that what we are aiming towards is the development of a global web-based mutual learning community where we are supporting leading edge development of disciplines and fields of endeavor in different societies and connecting the pioneers of human and social development in different societies together to accelerate and support the learning. I mean, much the same way that science developed only when it became an international or a cooperative endeavor. We need to develop a similar movement, but where the focus is on a combination of science and ethics, where we're subjecting the creation, development, and application of conduct standards to the same kind of careful scrutiny that we would with creation of scientifically validated knowledge, so that we can, the fact that we haven't developed our ethical capacity at the same rate that we've developed our scientific and technical capacity is primarily because we haven't paid close attention to, we haven't turned our focus and our priority to understanding conduct standards and how human beings develop the value systems that they then operate on a day-to-day basis. Just harking back to this earlier stage when I was on that 2-year existential walkabout of the Mormon mission, but this is a note that I wrote in my journal on November the 22nd, 1963, when I was in Quebec City with another missionary. They sent us up there just to get us out of the way, basically. There are only 2 of us there. And some of you, the audience, might recognize that date as being the date that JFK was assassinated. And it's hard for anyone who's not alive at the time and who had that kind of association with Kennedy as a kind of iconic figure of someone who was attempting to break out of the mold of a conventional political practitioner, and someone who was genuinely progressive in a number of ways. He had lots of flaws, but it was devastating to those of us who were really concerned about waste, suffering, and injustice. And the first few, I won't share the whole note, but the last paragraph, I start off just by saying that, and this is late at night that I'm writing this, that I was experiencing a great deal of pain and sorrow and a sense of shame about our species, that we could do this. And I finished it up by saying, writing to myself, This pain can be put to use. Using the principles that I might find amongst the great men and great thinkers, I will try to build an understanding so that I might be of service to the betterment of mankind. I dedicate my life and energy to this. I will use the pain that comes from the suffering and the waste of my fellow men as a mainspring from which to draw energy for the little I may be able to contribute. If I do not contribute anything, it will be because I was not able, not because I did not try. This will be the theme of my life. So I wrote that when I was 20 years old, and I read it and share it as an example of something that was really critical to engaging in this journey. One is, and first of all, I should apologize for the language of when I refer to mankind. I don't mean the gender men, I mean human beings. I was not skillful enough in the use of language to see that at that point. But the important part of that is that one is if you don't consciously dedicate at least part of your life to trying to contribute to our species development, you won't do it. You'll spend your life on other things, and that's okay. We don't expect everybody to do that. Not everybody's going to become an elder. Not everybody is going to be on a pathway to wisdom. That's fine. But somebody has to be. Because where there's a will, there's a way is not always true, but there will never be a way if there are not many wills. We need more people out there pushing on this frontier. But the important part of that commitment is the recognition that I may not succeed. But if I don't succeed, it won't be because I gave up. And that really is an important part of the story, because we encounter so many people who are thoughtful and caring and want to contribute, but when they discover how hard it is, they give up. They develop a sense that if I can't see the results of my work immediately, then it's beyond me. So they just shut it down. And by shutting that escape clause then, and I don't think that I realized at the point that that's what I was doing, but I was, and that's what sustained me, from, so it's now, it's 54 years ago I wrote that. So that it's just an indication, and of course, I'm not a particularly good example in lots of ways, and I don't want people to think that I'm any kind of a role model at all. I'm a map maker and a pioneer, and if people are drawn to what it is that I'm saying and doing, it's important for them to remember that what is moving about it is not me, it's what I'm pointing to. And that when you point to our common humanity and the responsibility that we have to each other and to the future and future generations, people are moved by it. But it's important for them to recognize why they're moved and to accept that they're part of that story as well. So,
what is the key takeaway that you want people to take away from not just this interview, but from your work?
Just recognize that as being a human being and being alive today, you are born with certain privileges and certain responsibilities. And you can't expect those responsibilities to simply magically appear in front of you. You have to actively work to figure out what those responsibilities are. As I express to people who ask me about my belief in God, my answer is that if you mean God, the creator, no, I don't. But if you mean God the creating, yes, I do. But I don't have to completely destroy my critical thinking capability to believe in God the creating, because it's empirical. We're here. Life exists. The universe has something about it that creates life and intelligence. And that our responsibility is to figure out not how to worship God, but how to be helpful. How to be helpful in the process of creating. And our species has given ourselves an honorific biological name of Homo sapiens sapiens. Sapiens means wise, but it's aspirational. It's not a statement of having arrived at being wise. And that we have, I believe, a responsibility to try to figure out how to be helpful to that creative process of the universe that makes it possible for human beings and life to exist. Yeah, that's what I'd like them to take away.